Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you all for being here. This is our second webinar from the Nature Education course. And I am delighted to present our guest, Luis Camargo from Colombia. And I will do a formal introduction of him in a minute. As you are arriving and settling in, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and say hello. And where are you joining us from? So just so you know, we will have like a 40-minute presentation and then 20 minutes of question and answer that me and Renda will be in charge to collect your question. While Luis is speaking, you are welcome also to post your questions, comments in the chat, and I will be in charge to gather them toward the end. So saying that, I just want to thank again, Luis, for your generous time. And I will welcome you. So our webinar title for today is Nature-Based Education as a Pathway Towards Sustainable and Regenerative Cultures. And about Luis, he's the founder and director of the Organization for Environmental Education and Protection, OPEPA, a nonprofit organization focused on reconnecting youth to nature and people to the earth to build more sustainable, regenerative, and peaceful communities. OPEPA is invested in the advancement of nature-based and regenerative education, heritage interpretation, and weaving. Luis is also currently the Regional Latin American Vice Chair of the IUCN Commission on Education and Communication.
Hey, Karen, could you please mute yourself?
Yes.
Thank you. So Luis is co-leader, convener of Colombia Regenerative Initiative, working to strengthen bioregional transition to regenerative cultures. He is the co-founder of the Weaving Lab, which aims to create thriving learning ecosystem by helping change leaders to become more aligned, collaborative, and systematic. In addition, he's a climate reality leader for the Climate Reality Project and has been recognized for his work as an Ashoka Fellow, Salzburg Fellow, and Young Global Leader, among others. So welcome, Luis, and thank you for being here, and we're looking forward to your
Thank you, Elena, and thank you, Elena, for the presentation, and I'm really excited to be here. Really, it is uncommon, to say the least, to have a group really focused on nature-based education around the world, and so it's really beautiful to see a group of people kind of gathering in this subject, which is so important. As Elena said, I work in a nonprofit that has been working in nature-based education for over 25 years. And when we started, actually, I was looking at the environmental issues around the world and realizing that the relationship between humans and nature was one of the root causes of, the planetary chaos. And that was what motivated us to create OPEPA. After 25 years of working, we've worked with over 130,000 students in wilderness programs and different nature-based focus programs, mostly in Colombia, but also in Central and South America, even in the USA. In Colorado, we did some programming also for climate education with NASA. And I really want to start coming back to where we are. So we're definitely in our planet. So give you maybe a minute or two to just wiggle your bodies and, just shake off what was coming, your past of the day, and take a couple of deep breaths and try to really anchor yourself down to the land where we're sitting, standing, or next. Try to evaporate all those layers of cement and other things we might have underneath us. And just with a couple of breaths and project yourself back into the ground. So breathe deep, and as you exhale, just anchor yourself down. So it's always good to start anchoring. And anchoring because we're definitely in a very special place. And I'll briefly intro the context of our thinking, and then I'll go into really how we're applying it and the theories behind it. But it all starts, with these pictures. This is the Earthrise picture from Apollo 8 in 1968. And it was the first time, astronauts were able to see the Earth rising in the lunar horizon after the first flight around the moon. And from this time on, many things changed, I think, in the way we perceive ourselves and we perceive the Earth. And it is followed by some other, space travel images, like this one in 1972. And, it's one of the few images that started to make us think that we live actually in an independent planet that's floating in the endless space. And we're self-contained. And as astronauts were looking at this picture and seeing the clouds move, they were also understanding that we are in a living planet where everything is interconnected and interdependent. You see no borders, you see no country frontiers or no walls from this picture. We are all here. And then the last picture in this series is a picture taken in 1990 in the outskirts of the planetary system. And it's called the pale blue dot because it really emphasizes that we are living in this small speck in an infinite space, or what can be felt as an infinite space. So this brings us to really a reflection. And nature is like this duck. Nature is quite complex, quite dynamic, and beautiful at the same time. But when we look at nature and what has happened in the last 100 years in the way we interpret, we study, we learn, we educate, this is the duck we're actually looking at more and more often. So it's a duck that's been reduced and simplified into mechanics so we can understand it. But by doing this and reinforcing this reductionist perspective, we have transformed our way of connecting and understanding nature as a whole into understanding nature as fragments and pieces of machinery. This process, after the industrialization and some other more philosophical movements in the last century, has really separated humans and nature and made us think that we are not nature. We are separate from nature, and nature is there for our use and for other interpretations. But this is fundamental because when we look at nature clearly, nature doesn't work that way. When we look at the soil you anchor to, it's actually full of millions of different elements. One of them being mycelium, and mycelium being, the body of a lot of the fungus that actually connects us underneath the ground and connects all plants and all life. This fungus we never see because the only thing we see is the fruit that actually sometimes comes out of the ground or of trunks. Underneath this, the mycelium is actually connecting an incredible network of trees, plants, and supporting the capacity for communication between all these species and to transfer nutrients and different elements from one to another to support all life in our planet. So even though I know you are aware of Earth as a system, it is important to remember this because if we have no nature, we have no future. Actually, humans are another species living on Earth, and Earth supports everything for us. So supports our food, supports our health, and supports life. And in the words of Janine Benyus, who is the pioneer of biomimicry, she, studying the way Earth has evolved in 3.8 billion years, comes to the conclusion that life creates a condition conducive to life. And this could be considered as one of the main regenerative principles of life. The only reason life has evolved since it began, it's because everything that is created and emerges is in one function or with one objective, which is creating conditions conducive to life. So all the relations, all the innovations, the evolution of the different species ultimately happened to create a very complex system that supports itself. And this is really important because if we look at the way we've been developing in the world, it has been very different since we separated from the Earth. So in this graph, and I'm not sure if you've talked a little bit about regeneration, but this is a crucial concept to understand and bring back down to the role nature-based education might have. In the sense that if we look at the way we have been relating in conventional practice and development models, which is the corner in the left inferior part of the graph, it's a system that really is based on two things. One is based on nature and all the resources to be transformed for our benefit. And two, in a lot of energy that has to be put into the system to transform those resources. So conventional development, the one we are seeing now, is really a development that is based in these two elements. So it's really transforming nature, degenerating or degrading natural systems by using a lot of energy. And this is ultimately bringing us to the situation we are today, where the planet and the planetary systems are in flux. In this sense, we need to understand how we can transform that to what nature does, which is creating the conditions for life in all systems. But when we speak of sustainable development, we've still been very slow in understanding because we start from a very degenerative system. We realize we're doing the damage and we say, let's move to sustainability. Sustainability is the midpoint where we're trying to create the damage, but also temper the damage and be in a zero equation. But the reality is that if we want to evolve, things have to shift. So we need to keep on moving towards a relationship where Earth stops doing negative, let's say, damage to living systems, and we start restoring nature, and then reconciling our relationship to nature. And last but not least, becoming actors of regeneration, or as Glenn Albert, a good friend, says, creating a symbiotic capacity where we have mutualistic relationships, where we're really, as human beings, fostering that all life in the planet is actually thriving around us. And this requires a really big shift in the way we think, in the way we act. It requires a shift in the way, let's say, we understand ourselves and we interpret the world. So shifting from a linear, mechanistic, extractive, command and control based power over things, where there's trade-offs, short-term separation as a rationale, and everything is logical and analytical, to a system that replicates a little more how healthy ecosystems work, where energy and processes are circular. The important center of things is life and adaptability where we're really inclusive and regenerative and looking for anyone that's aligning to that capacity of creating the conditions for life to thrive, and fostering and sustaining those capacities, where we can really be inclusive and work power with others, collaboration, synergies, intergenerational, interconnected, and obviously the capacity to embody this new awareness and this new way of being.
Hi, Luis. Sorry to interrupt, but I would like to know if it is your setting that has my box in that I think is interfering with your slides. I have tried to get rid of it, but it doesn't seem that that I can do that by myself.
What are you seeing?
Like my picture, my profile picture, I think was in your screen, and it was like overlapping your slides. Yes. And
let me see if I can move it.
thank you. So
Maybe, yeah.
or you can
There.
minimize me. Yes.
Yeah, I got it.
Thank
I got
you
it.
so much. Okay,
Sorry,
thank you.
sorry.
It's okay.
Okay, so thank you. So continuing in the path towards regeneration, I have really come to think that regeneration is one of the traps that we might be facing now. It was sustainability starting in the 90s, but now regeneration has become this word that everybody's using. So we really need to understand what regeneration is. And as I said, the basic principle of regeneration is the capacity to create the conditions for life to thrive. So as a big meta principle. But regeneration, in my understanding, can have two dimensions, a shallow dimension and a deep dimension. And this I took more from the work of Aldo Leopold and Arnaiz in their exploration of ecology. So there's an ecology that is functional, which is shallow ecology, and a deep ecology that's more spiritual, that is more principle based. And using this framework, I try to understand regeneration. So regeneration can be shallow in practices and processes. So regenerative agriculture, regenerative economics, regenerative businesses, everything that is emerging now is shallow in that sense. That's because it's practices and processes. But we really need to understand the impact and the need for deep regeneration, which is really based on the underlying principles and the ways of being. Because ultimately, our relationship with the planet is about how we are, our way of being. And this is where nature-based education really comes in. Because if we look at education to the moment, education was also reduced to machinery in this process in the last century, where mechanics and the need of producing people with knowledge to function within industry that is reduced into mechanics and pieces. So education always accompanied that trend and created a system where we actually are learning in ways that are disconnected, disassociated, and where we're really not understanding the world we live in. We understand very well very specific parts of the processes, but we're really not getting the whole picture. So nature-based education for me has the potential to activate what I call our regenerativeness or our regenerative capacity. And if we understand regeneration and we understand how nature can activate our regenerative capacity, then nature-based education becomes a really powerful approach to shifting educational practices. And as you know, nature has that power. And I've seen it. This is an exercise we did in Vancouver, Canada. And it was to make a proof point. We created a loose parts environment in a public park, and we just created a space with trunks, logs, sand, water, and just bits and pieces of natural elements. And we invited a bunch of kids from a school to walk in with no direction whatsoever. And what happened was incredible, as you might imagine. The kids came in, started seeing these things. They were shy a little bit initially, but it only took one person to take the sticks and start moving them, to start seeing conversations, negotiations, collective creative processes, to build shelters, to create all kinds of things that you could never have imagined. And this proves that nature has the capacity to awaken our creative and our learning and our full essence. Nature inspires us. So in that process, not only in the process we've been living in the last 25 years with Pepa, we've realized there's three critical things that are needed for these nature-based education experiences to actually really start activating our capacity, our regenerative capacity. And it has to do with not with new approaches or new practices, but with how we combine them. So we realize that information and knowledge is fundamental. So that intellectual experience, where most of our education today is anchored, is important. Filtering and working for the head. Additionally, we realize that the connection with the body, our hands, and our senses is fundamental. So the head must be accompanied by experiences with the body. But last and not least, those two things need to be interpreted and need to be put on the surface on our emotional experiences. So we really need to integrate the heart. So if we integrate the head, the body, and the heart, we actually can create experiences that move people beyond, learning knowledge or information, but to actually create learning experiences that allow us to realize our interbeing, or realize that we are interconnected and interdependent, as species or individuals of a huge system that is alive, that is dynamic, that it's moving. So in this process, we created, let's say, a really three-step strategy, which starts with this: connecting deeply. Part of the motivation for our creation was the human nature separation. So one of the critical parts is the human nature reconnection. And in doing this, we realized that, humans connect to nature, but then nature helps us connect to ourselves and to others. And this is fundamental. And as we connect to nature, so we have experiences in nature that foster empathy, foster our capacity to be at awe, to be, to explore, discover, and really connect with nature. We increase empathy. And empathy, if you look at education, we've been talking about the last 15 years on social emotional learning and 21st century skills, but it always has been very much focused on the humans side, so very anthropocentric. And in this case, connection with nature really helps us move beyond the human aspect and the human limitation into a living system relationship of connection, of a sense of belonging and sense of place and sense of interbeing, like Thich Nhat Hanh, the Zen philosopher, has presented, which is a really interesting concept where we really start understanding and feeling and embodying our interconnected essence. So after we connect deeply, we also need to awaken the naturalist within our students and within ourselves. And this is interesting because, naturalism is a practice that for many has been somewhat lost. I remember reading in school about, the great naturalists, but today, less and less, we hear about naturalists. We hear about, very specialized scientists. But naturalists, for me, represent that kind of person that's always observing, always sensing, and sensing both the visible and the invisible. And this is maybe the key point. Because in environmental education, we're used to teaching, or in science, natural sciences education, we're used to teaching students about the plants, about the rivers, about the cycles, all these type of process oriented, but we're really not guiding students to sense the invisible. And the invisible has to do with the relationships between all the visible items, the energy flows, and the essential qualities of relationship. So Awaken the Naturalist is really about awakening and fostering awe, curiosity, and the capacity to discover the visible and the invisible. So through nature-based education, you connect students deeply, so they learn to connect to be nature, and they start learning to sense the visible and the invisible, and to start understanding the flows and the qualities of relationships all around us in living systems. And that activates our capacity to really move students to act for regeneration. Because once we understand, first of all, we are heightened in our empathic qualities and capacities, we feel we are nature, we understand our interconnected and interdependent self. And then we understand and we can observe the dynamics around us, the influence of different actions, of different situations in the system. We can really start acting for regeneration. And with this, appropriating a new type of leadership, a leadership that goes beyond stewardship into planetary citizenship. So David Sobel, which I'm sure you've read some of his work, but this is a really good quote, because if we want children to flourish, to become truly empowered, let us allow them to love the earth before we ask them to save it. And I think this flows into that deep connection. That is the starting point of everything. And this allows us to activate something that Joanna Macy said, which is active hope. Is the capacity to have hope in our capacity to build and create or write the story of the world we want to see. And this is really, really critical in the process of activating our regenerative capacity. So let's explore a little bit more what this entails. Many times we believe, we need a perfect map. And without that map, we can't act. And the truth is that we have been focusing so much on the pathways and the map that we have lost our direction. And what we actually need is understanding this general direction. And for me, regeneration has become that principle. If everything we do in education and in development and in our own lives is working to create the conditions for life to thrive, as humanity, we would reincorporate ourselves to living systems and actually be able to heal the planet and create the capacity for the planet to restore and regenerate. And it's all about one thing. And this is a Lakota indigenous elder in the United States. And they have one word, which is mitakuye o nasi. And this words means all our relations. And I think in our ancestral, let's say, communities around the world, there's many words that are like this in traditional language. So all our relations, it's the understanding and the embodiment in our way of life that all our relations are fundamental. Starting with our relationship with ourselves, which sometimes is lost. And nowadays, we're so fixated in the outside that we lose ourselves. And this is why we're seeing an increase in a lot of the mental health problems, of the loss of purpose, loss of sense of place, and sense of belonging. On the other hand, we need to also foster our relation with other humans. And this is where we have really focused in education in the last, let's say, 20 years with social emotional learning. But we definitely need to bring nature into education and foster our relationship to nature, because the key is this focus on relationships. Remember, that I said that awakening the naturalist spirit was about seeing the visible and the invisible. The invisible is all about the energy flows in the relationships, in pieces of the system. And in this case, we are humans that relate with ourselves, with others, and with nature. And we really need to have nature-based education, and education foster the idea of strengthening our capacity to be in right relation, like indigenous communities say. So being in right relation is being in relation that fosters that capacity to create the conditions for life. And this, if you look at this graph that I created, you know, when we talk about our relationship with nature, we definitely build our interbeing capacity. Our relationship with society, we start creating this collective awareness and our capacity to understand collective well-being as human communities. And when we integrate the relationship of society and nature, we start realizing the importance of diversity. Diversity in nature is actually what has allowed nature to have the most opportunities to innovate, to evolve. In human systems, diversity is really important, but we have made it a point to create conflict from it, which makes no sense, because the most diverse ecosystems are the most thriving ecosystem, the most prosperous. And we're talking about diversity in human systems being both cultural and ecological. So understanding diversity and understanding the primary role of collaboration in the system. So these are concepts that need to be ingrained in nature-based education. So I'll go through one example of one of the projects we've been doing in Colombia. And this is called the Red de Colegios Cerro de Bogotá, or the Bogota Mountain School Network. And actually it started with the idea of Bogota is in a plateau, in a high altitude plateau with mountains around it. So you can see the mountains all around where the creeks are born. And the city is 10 million plus population, so it's a pretty big city, but the mountains are a really big part of the city. And in the reflection of what would Bogota be without the mountains, brought us to the idea that definitely nature around us and the geography around us defines a lot of who we are and where we are and what we are. So integrating the mountains around Bogota into education was a fundamental component of actually updating education. And we created this network to be able to connect schools through natural spaces. So nature reserves in the mountains and green areas in the city as a way of really creating a citywide community, learning community. So as you can see, all the dots in the map are the schools that are being connected. We have right now over 100 schools that are connected and working together to create different things. And using the power of collaboration, we also realized that, you know, nature-based education can become only one thing that is done by us with students in nature, but it becomes much more powerful when we involve others. So here we started combining a school like Gimnasio Femenino, OPEPA, a nonprofit organization working to preserve the mountains, the Biodiversity Institute of the country, botanical gardens, museums, and other things, to build this network. And this network was looking to create the nature-based learning citywide environment. And it was really interesting because we started bringing in our first year 18 schools with a couple of students, and it started building itself. It's a horizontal network. It's a self-generated network. So it's a network that really has the leaders are putting out some energy into it to start it, but the energy is actually being picked up by the network itself. So it works much like a forest, and students from different parts of the city, different socioeconomic levels or, you know, approaches, different histories, started meeting in nature. And nature played a huge role in becoming that neutral space for conversations. So children that would never meet or would never talk because of their prejudice and their cognitive biases of each other found in nature and working through nature the capacity to look at themselves eye to eye and start talking and start building visions of the city they wanted together. And this was really powerful. And this was activated through the 3 levels that I told you about. So connecting deeply, awakening the natural spirit, and acting for regeneration collectively as communities in natural and public spaces. So you can see here how students work together, and this session in the botanical garden was really interesting because in each table you see, you have students from different places and different origins, and they each created a vision of the city they imagined. And then we put all those visions together to have the youth vision of the city. And when you actually look at the utopian images, we realize that youth really want to see systems thriving. So how can we foster the capacity for them to build and tell the story, in action of that place they want to build? How do we teach them or foster the capacity for them to start building those places? So the network became a really cool way, and I think cool because we started with the network and it picked up this traction, um, and it helped to restore many public areas of the city. A key role of the network is the teachers. So we actually connected schools, principals, we connected teachers from schools, and we connected students. But the teachers played a huge role because initially only science teachers were sent to these encounters. And progressively, schools started understanding that it was all teachers that could participate. And we were using flow learning methodologies and other nature-based techniques and experiential learning techniques to actually train teachers to facilitate nature-based education that was significant. And one thing we discovered is that currently most teachers are very disconnected, not only from the earth, but from their capacity to be teachers that foster learning experiences for discovery. So teachers were so amazed to learn and to discover how they were learning and how they could really share this quality of discovery with their students and learn with students. So this was really a highlight for me. And right now it's one of the core principles in working with the different networks, activating teachers. As we evolved as the network, we realized that a self-organizing ecosystem needs to organize itself through natural elements. So the network, which is 100, 10 plus schools, was difficult to put together and work together sometimes because we have one corner of the city to the other corner of the city could be 2 hours, 3 hours in car. So it's very far away, and gathering people was very difficult. So we realized that water would tell the story. The mountains receive the water and create the creeks, and the creeks create the watersheds that move from the mountains down into the Bogota River Valley. So we actually started creating nodes based on watersheds. And the watersheds became the bioregional, localized, natural element that connected the schools that were around those watersheds. And we started working on citizen science projects that were in combination. So schools would share and work together to start monitoring the river, monitoring the air, monitoring biodiversity. And this gave also a way of connecting with the curriculum in the school. So citizen science became a bridge between the nature-based learning experiences and the academic learning that the school was requiring. So we did collections and water samples and created a water quality map that was co-created by students of the whole city. Something that when we were speaking with the authorities, for them just doing one creek would cost thousands of dollars. And in the collaborative work of the network, in one day, we could have a picture of the whole city water quality of the creeks. So it's incredible and powerful. The same we did with biodiversity using iNaturalist. So we created little hubs and projects, and students started recollecting and identifying species and creating guides for all the biodiversity around their schools. And in this process, creating really a source of information that was being connected with the National Biodiversity Information System and let's say giving information to conservation in the country. So in this process, we created a learning ecosystem, and we actually wove a learning ecosystem. So what is weaving a learning ecosystem is not only creating a network, but actually creating those invisible threads that connect schools, connect teachers, connect students, and connect people to the land. So as they weave, learning becomes more significant and relationships start defining learning. And in this case, one city. But from one city, we actually last year replicated this model in 14 cities of Colombia. So right now we have 14 citywide laboratories like this working where the inspiration and capacity is actually built into the schools, to the teachers, and the students are creating learning communities that relate nature and the cities together. So to summarize a little bit everything I've spoken of, creating learning experiences, nature-based learning experiences for us has been a process of connecting deeply, learning how to sense, activating the capacity to act regeneratively in order for us to co-evolve. So that's the line you see. But if you look at the process we've discovered is that in the development of us as humans, there are processes that are parallel to this. So when we're born, our first 6 years, neuroplasticity is fundamental, and we have forgotten, the capacity of nature-based education to actually foster and stimulate neuroplasticity. So we need to incorporate it. After, we're able to build this neurological capacity to understand and sense and connect to nature, the cognitive relational aspects of learning in primary become really important. And that's where a lot of the experiences and interpretation must come in order for us to start understanding and creating resonant living systems and becoming people that can adapt and be in service to nature. And if we look at the bottom line, this actually goes in parallel with our educational age system. So nature-based education actually, I think now, and if we want to focus it towards regenerative principles, needs to start when we're born, needs to start really fostering environments and stimulation and interactions and experiences that help us connect deeply and learn how to sense. These two components are fundamental and are associated directly with our neuroplasticity and our capacity to learn to use our senses and to learn to interpret and see. And that will allow us to move from an ego-centered community like we are now to an eco-centered and even more to what, in Sanskrit would be called Siva, which would be in service. And in this case, a community where humans can be in service to life. And this, for me, would be really the end goal of nature-based education, creating the opportunities for students and for people to connect deeply, learn how to sense, and start acting in service to life. So remember, critical part of this is falling back in love with nature, and this is it. So I open up for questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Luis. Here is a round of applause Thank you for this inspiring presentation that you shared with us. We have like many comments in the chat, and we also have like 2 previous questions in the chat that I will get now. So they are both from Mark, and I think he wants you to explain the graphic with the XY axis again. I think my picture was in that one, very in the middle. And yeah, so that's the first question. If you can go briefly to that graphic. And
okay, let me go back and I'll show you.
specifically, yeah, he said, could you explain further and also move toward right? So Mark, also, if you are here and you want to unmute yourself and like say with your own words, what was your question, you are welcome to do that.
All right, thank you. You mentioned sustainability being in the middle, and I didn't catch what the context was that pertaining to. And I thought that that's maybe net zero or net use versus what's being overall conserved. I didn't know if that we could move towards a positive side where you have more benefits than the negative deterioration that was occurring as part of sustainability. Why does it have to be?
Correct. So the idea, oh, sorry, something happened. The idea, can you see the graph?
Yes.
Yeah.
Mark?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
So the idea in this graph, and this graph is created by Reed and Daniel Wall, who wrote a really interesting book, if you're interested in regeneration, called Designing Regenerative Cultures. And it really shows is the continuum of development models. So from a very exploitative approach with increased use of energy, and as you see here is the degradation of natural systems, so degenerative and use of energy. So moving from systems that decrease the vitality of living systems towards the center point, where we are actually looking into sustainability. And let me say something. When the Brundtland Commission defined sustainability, it was defined in a different way. Unfortunately, our let's say operational appropriation of sustainability came to understand from businesses that sustainability was the capacity to lessen our damage and to replace that damage and create almost a zero equation of damage versus positive to create a net zero, like you said. So this is one way of understanding sustainability in this graph. So this is why sustainability is considered the neutral point. We're not doing more damage, but we're just sustaining our capacity for future generations. Nonetheless, if you look at living systems, do not stay in the neutral position. They actually create the conditions to regenerate constantly, self-regeneration, and to create the energy they need for that regeneration. So a living system is actually using other mechanisms to create the conditions for life to thrive. So this is where this corner comes. So in development, we're coming from a really, let's say, this corner where the traditional, conventional system, and we need to start moving towards a system that helps us not only restore the damage we already did, but actually create the conditions for the system to thrive. And that means changing many things in the way we approach and relate to the earth and to life. I'm not sure if that helps clear your question.
It does. I just thought sustainability could also encompass regenerative approach, not that it was limited to just a neutral definition.
Okay. No, and I agree. In the initial definition in the Brundtland Commission, and they did include a broader aspect, but the way we have instrumentalized sustainability really is limiting. So right now, part of the concept is how do we go beyond the scaffolding that sustainability has created into a regenerative thinking capacity. Okay, so it's like everything, just a way of interpreting and trying to understand. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you so much. We also have a question from Marianne Krasny, also professor here at Cornell and the director of the Civic Ecology Lab. So she's asking, at what age do you think young children are able to engage in restoring system, not only nature play? And also, Marianne, if you would like to unmute, you are welcome to.
Yeah, so I know, thank you, Luis. It was really a great presentation and beautiful images. It shows you took a lot of care to put that together, because I know how hard it is to make beautiful slides like that, but as well as your ideas, but and yeah, it's what you shared with us. But okay, so you talked about, you had some slides of young children with the soil and connecting to nature, just free nature play, but you also had slides of children planting trees, I think, I'm not sure what it was, doing some restoration work. And so do you think a child at any age, like 3 or 4 or 5, could be involved in that tree planting, or you think there's sort of different stages of involvement?
I think childs can be involved in any age. Obviously, their mobility is going to be a factor, but I think getting involved in any age is really important, because it doesn't matter your developmental, let's say, moment. Your capacity to interpret the experience, the relation, and the emotion is always there. So we've worked with intergenerational groups where the adult is doing a much more cognitive, structured approach to reforestation, and they're thinking about the distance between trees, and they're thinking about all these things, and maybe the other species, and understanding this more functional aspect. And you have a 3-year-old that's just sitting down, seeing the hole, playing with it, patting down the soil when you plant the tree, and listening to the energy that's around. So I think one thing we have maybe forgotten to pay attention to is these invisible cues that help us learn. And nature, you have a kid that, in my case, my biggest example is my daughter. Since they were born, we've been very intentional of bringing them outside. And as I look at, my daughter and her friends, which live in a similar social context, similar family, same school, so it's relatively a controlled group in some way. You realize that the sensibility and the capacity to perceive and relate is very different. And for me, the conclusion was that, early age is really important, to be out there, to be in contact with the capacity to perceive and learn to sense. Because we can say it's intuition, but I think it's much more. I think our bodies have the capacity to sense much more, especially when you're in nature. And when we're talking with nature educators, and my own experience, the more you are synchronized with that, the more capacity you have to walk into a forest and start sensing the forest. And this is something that is built, developed. It's not only something that, it's a vocational element specific to an individual. And I think it's developed with a continuous exposure. And if you look at the history of the US, and you guys are in the United States, I think the Sierra Club did a study where they actually looked at leaders around the world that are doing positive environmental actions. And after studying all the leaders, they realized that one of the common things they had was early exposure to nature. In moments where maybe their cognitive relationship was different, not necessarily developed, but their emotional and their energetical relationship was developed, and the neurological or neuroplasticity was being developed under those conditions. So I think there's and this is my hypothesis, is that education for regeneration needs to start the day we're born, in such a way that we can actually thread our nervous system to become regenerators. And this is something I really want to explore and look into more academically also. But I think that's one of the keys.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think this could be like a follow-up questions to Marianne's. It's from Imani, and it's where see nature before school incorporated to the regenerative model. So, Luis, are you familiar with the first school movement and
Yes.
nature preschool? And again, Imani, if you are here and you want to unmute to clarify better your question, you are welcome.
I think it was Doria that had the question. I just made a statement.
Okay, so that's the question.
Yeah,
Luis.
sorry, that's true. It was me, but I also think that Luis, in talking about, I mean, I'm happy to hear more, but I think you addressed it when you were talking about how kids learn just now as well.
Okay, thank you. So Luis, would you like to add something, or should we move on to another question?
We can move on to another question.
Okay, so there's no any more question in the chat, so you are welcome to raise your hand and or mute yourself. But if you raise your hands, Renda or I will take care to support you or to facilitate the process. We only have like 2 or 3 more minutes. So feel free to unmute or raise your hands and we'll try to keep track of it. Okay, so we have someone. So it's very hard to try to see who has his or her hands raised, but I can see that that there's someone with
It's Maria.
Me.
Yeah,
Yes,
so
it's me.
on mute. Yes, please, thank you.
Thank you, Elena. Okay, Luis, I have a question. I'm from Colombia too. You were talking about that you have like some ages that you develop the thing. So first you recognize the nature with the little kids from preschool. Next, when next you interact with them and approach to the nature with the toddlers. Next, you do action with the adolescents, and some of that was that you show us in your presentation. But my question is, you can do, you have to do in your experience that in that order, or you think a toddler can do it in do action in his age?
Yeah. Thanks,
I can
Maria.
be clear. Thank you.
I get the and love that you're from Colombia. So please get in touch. But actually, you know, these are ways of visualizing. And even though it's a structure that I have seen that, you know, early ages are more focused in connecting, then it develops to sensing, then to action. It all happens at every age. So it's not as sequential and it's not divided on ages, really. So even with little toddlers, we can work in connecting deeply, in sensing, and in acting. It doesn't matter. The sequence needs those 3 things because, you know, you connect this, creating that resonance, learning to sense, is learning to observe, and then acting is putting all together. So I guess what's important is not the age, but the process, really thinking that we can't go straight into acting only if we're not developing the empathy with nature and the capacity to sense the systems, because then it becomes just creating habits. And that's what happens a lot with the, let's say, environmental campaigns in the world. We teach how to, close the water when you're not using it, or turn the light off. And these are creating habits. But those habits are not connected with the capacity of that person to feel that he's or she is interconnected and interdependent in a living system. That only happens when we foster the learning experiences that allow to connect deeply. And connecting deeply is not only being in nature, it's actually processing that information from knowledge, information or knowledge, body experience, and emotions. So those two things have to happen simultaneously, because even in let's say, nature or flow learning, for example, that I imagine you've heard, and you've covered a little bit of flow learning, Elena, in your classes?
No.
Okay, so any type of, let's say, experiential learning in nature, generates an experience. Sometimes it has more information than others, but most of the times the information is or very academic or very separate. And then the debriefing, the processing of that experience is focused at the individual experience, but not at the relational experience. So I think one of the key components is that when we are processing these experiences, we really need to focus on those invisible connections. So what are the relational aspects of you with yourself, with others, and with nature, those three levels? So when we're talking about, for example, we have an activity that's moving maps or emotional mapping. And in that activity, students together map out and create a map of a space. It could be a park, it could be a trail, whatever. And in creating the map, they create the physical map using, journaling techniques, but they create the emotional map. And the emotional map associated to how they feel, how they relate, and how others in the space, are relating energy-wise and feeling-wise. So we're pushing them to allow themselves to come into what I would call the moment of silence. And that moment of silence allows for the emergence of listening to other things. And this is kind of cryptic, and I'm sorry, but it's difficult to explain via this flat screen. But in this process, when you get students back together and they show you the maps and they converse and start sharing their emotions, their relations, they start discovering the interconnections that were not visible for them. And they start discovering things. And this process is what I mean that is really important. And if you look at that, an activity, short activity that can be an hour, 2 hours, is actually deeply connecting, is actually teaching them or giving them opportunity to sense. And they're acting in a way, maybe here more in the exercise, they're journaling, they're putting into practice that interpretation of the body, of the mind, into something they can express and share. So this is the first level of acting, talking about your experience and your relations. The second level of acting is actually questioning, okay, so if this is the way you read the space, you feel the space, and you understand the relationships, how can we foster creating conditions for this space to thrive? So that would be the next level. But as you can see, it's actually the combination of all these things and making sure that we're surfacing in the conversations, in the processes, these elements. With younger kids that do not have maybe the capacity to express themselves in the same manner, art becomes really important. Colors, emotions, very simple emotions. And then in the younger kids, it's really, more the experience and listening to the essential qualities of the educators. So I feel, and this, I think the people that work in the forest kindergartens can relate to that. The energy of the facilitators of nature-based education is as important as the environment and the learning. Because if you are shedding loving experiences that foster creativity and laughter and awe and these type of experiences are being associated with nature, with this space of discovery, you know, that connection develops into knowledge. So I think it's a combination. So you definitely need to do everything with every age. I've worked with adults where you still need to connect deeply. You still need to, we need to learn everything all the time and be in full contact. It's a circular more than a linear process.
Thank you so much. So we ran out of time. So thank you so much, Luis, for your generous time. Awesome or fantastic presentation. We really appreciate your work. It is at least inspired me, and I guess it inspires a lot of participants that are here. Thank you so much. We will be connecting with you, and we are so grateful that we get to meet what OPEPA does in Colombia and around the world. So thank you so much. For Chinese participants, Brenda will stay with you to support you, facilitate any languages barriers that you might have had in this seminar. So for everybody else, you are welcome to exit the webinar, and we will be waiting for you next Thursday. Thank you, Luis, again, so much.
Thank you very much, and lovely to be here. And I congratulate you for all being here. I think this is one of the most important actions in our times.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And you can connect with me. Feel free to contact me via email, and I left my LinkedIn profile also. So feel free to contact me, and would love to hear from you.
Okay. Thank you so much. Brenda, if you want to please take the meeting, so I know for sure that Chinese audience is connected with you, I would appreciate that.
Yes, thank you, Luis and Elena.